I wasn't a big fan of the first Uncharted game, but I was definitely in the minority. Most major publications gave it critical acclaim, and its sequel, Among Thieves, would release just 2 years later to even more praise. My expectations were low, but I tried my best to go into it with an open mind.
Here you go. Say I never do anything for you.
Once again, we follow the adventures of Nathan, Elena, and Sullivan, along with new characters Chloe Fraser and Harry Flynn. This time on the trail to discover the lost kingdom of Shambhala, more popularly known as Shangri-La. Within lies the legendary Chintamani stone, a massive jewel worth millions.
Oh my God, Flynn! What? Marco Polo found Shambhala. Shangri-La! You're joking. If they were carrying the Chintamani stone, it might still be there.
It's all very fascinating, but we really gotta go.
But of course, some things go wrong along the way. So it's basically a retread of the first game, but in some new locales, and the stakes are a bit higher. There are more plot twists this time around, and I found them more satisfying too. Characters and their motivations are more complicated, and overall, the story is just better told. Writing and acting are, once again, of the highest quality. It really is quite impressive how Nolan North, the actor for Nathan Drake, manages to keep his character so enjoyable. He never gets old. If anything, it's quite the opposite. He's always getting more charming.
Well, here we are.
Now we just gotta find the right temple.
Well, that may be easier said than done.
No, tell me about it. Maybe we can... Oh, bingo. There it is.
That's the one.
Yeah, it's gotta be.
The one in the middle of all the gunfire and explosions.
Lucky us.
Nate, that's right where Lazarevich is camped. I was hoping we'd be headed in the opposite direction.
Well, desperate times, right?
Drake has been spotted in Sector 18.
Oh, crap. Any chance this is Sector 19?
Sweep the city, find him, and take him out.
Uncharted continues to prove itself as a visual marvel, and doubly so because there's more than just jungles and catacombs this time around. Significant chunks of the story are now spent in the city of Nepal, up in snowy mountains, through glistening icicle caverns, and plenty more. The way that water ripples to Nathan's footsteps and then calms down again once he stops walking is one of the many little details that goes a long way towards making the world a more fleshed out and believable environment. The gameplay is more of the same from the first Uncharted.
Oh, man, I'm so tired of climbing shit.
That's exactly how I felt in Drake's Fortune, but surprisingly, I don't mind it nearly as much here. It's still just hold the left stick and press X occasionally, but at least it's a lot more dynamic now. In the first game, the worst that would happen was some rocks coming loose, and it was usually really obvious when it was going to happen. Now, pieces of the environment are breaking apart all the time, or something gets in Nathan's way to divert his path, so it makes the action more exciting to watch. There are also a lot more moving parts, like this awesome clockwork machinery level, and rarely, a few areas actually require reflexes, planning, or might be under a time limit, so I actually found climbing in this game to be a lot more enjoyable. Puzzles return once more, and while it's still just referred to the manual, they're also far less frequent. Alongside the exploration aspect of the game, combat also received a significant and very necessary upgrade. The variety of firearms only increases slightly, but powerful weapons like the grenade launcher and sniper rifle show up much more frequently. The game's 3 assault rifles also perform differently from each other. The AK-47 is very powerful, but its recoil causes the crosshair to jump all over the place. The FAL is super accurate, but utilizes a 3-shot burst. Although, that burst firing is actually artificial. If you duck behind cover right after pulling the trigger, then the rifle will pause its fire and then automatically resume the remaining bullets via blind fire. It's a poor implementation, but I guess an attempt is better than nothing at all. But here's the big question. Can you still shoot through walls? Yup, you just can't get rid of a classic. It's a lot harder to abuse this time around because there's a depth of field effect that blurs out the background. This kind of prevents the glitch from being usable, but it's so disappointing that it hasn't been fixed altogether. Thankfully, it no longer needs to be relied upon because aiming out of cover is far more comfortable than in the first game. The camera zoom is much smoother and combat feels easier to grasp. Enemy variety was also an issue in the first Uncharted, and that's been resolved here in a big way. It's still mostly generic mercenaries using the same guns as you, but now they're mixed in with enemies that have varying levels of armor. Unlike the first game, I now have more of a reason to save my powerful weapons for specific targets. Or I can use an assault rifle for normal enemies and save the shotgun pistol for when the more heavily armored goons get too close. There are even a couple of bosses this time around. Nothing too crazy, but they do blend into the game as a natural part of the story, and they're great for breaking up the action and forcing the player to adapt to new situations. While the exploration and combat segments are mostly separated, similar to the first game, there are now more moments that blend the two together. Dedicated combat areas also have more complicated geometry, allowing the player to attack from up high, take cover from below, or other branching options. This is what was missing from the mostly linear first Uncharted, and the greater freedom of movement helps it stand out from other cover shooters that mostly stay on the ground, like in Gears of War. Now, I'm not trying to say that Uncharted 2 is flawless by any means. There's a new stealth mechanic that kind of works, but might have been better left on the cutting room floor. Enemies will often walk alone into dangerous spots and are practically asking to be taken out. It takes away from the feeling that you're outsmarting the opponent, and instead you're just going through a path set by the game's designers. As far as I can tell, no part of the game can be completed with 100% stealth anyway, so it's really meant to just soften up the enemy forces before the big battle takes place. What's unfortunate is that a huge chunk of the early game is spent going through a stealth tutorial, and then afterwards there's some mostly light combat in yet another jungle. The game doesn't really start to get good until a couple of hours in, which heavily discouraged me. I get the feeling that this is why Naughty Dog opted to start the game in media res, at a much more visually exciting part of the game, to get the player excited for what's to come. It's poorly done though, because it's not like it fixes the early levels, but at least it only gets better as the game goes on. Among Thieves is what Drake's Fortune should have been in the first place. The story, characters, and visuals are wonderful, and in this regard, it manages to improve upon the first game, which already set such a high bar. What the first Uncharted failed in, Among Thieves took measures to improve. Exploration is still mostly automatic, but now it's more exciting to look at. Combat is far improved with a greater variety of weapons and enemies, as well as more complex arenas that comes closer to an open-ended approach. While the first game stayed mostly in the jungle, Uncharted 2 goes all over the place. The early parts are a little sluggish, but once it starts getting good, it never slows down. It's also a bit longer too. I managed to complete it in about 11.5 hours on the crushing difficulty. Thankfully, it wasn't nearly as frustrating this time around. There were still plenty of deaths, sure, but the more options given to the player, as well as the more varied opposition, made the game more fun as well. There's definitely a question as to whether the first game is necessary as an introduction to the series. In a way, I would say no. Characters reintroduce themselves here quickly and efficiently, and the first game is hardly referred to at all. So if you're not too interested in seeing what the whole franchise has to offer, then skip Drake's Fortune and jump right into Among Thieves. On the other hand, is Among Thieves even worth playing on its own merits? It's still pretty short, and there's not much replay value to be had, but it is an above-average adventure that's fun to go through at least once. Whatever an 11-hour game is worth to you, I would say get it at that price.
Or that. Can be arranged.
Are you in?
Oh, hell yes. I was in before you were.
Thank you for watching my review of Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe.
Loud and clear.
We're getting close.
Okay, I've planted charges all around the perimeter of the